So, as anyone who's seen the comment section for my last video knows, I definitely screwed up aim down sight. The biggest mistake was that when you entered the aim down sight state, your view wasn't aligned properly with your view from the hip state. The reason for that was because when we're at the hip, the camera is attached to the head of our character, and when we moved to the aim down sight state, I was attaching the camera to the weapon. This resulted in the center of the camera's view being down and to the right from where the camera was in the hip state because the weapon is down and to the right from our character's head. The best way to make sure that the view center lines up perfectly in the hip and aim down sight states is to not move the camera at all. We have to instead move the weapon to the camera. My initial thought was to do this based on animations, but I quickly realized that making an animation that perfectly centered the reticle would mean that I'd need a different animation for every scope on every weapon. As fun as making all those animations sounded, I opted to use a procedural approach. I already had a socket placed exactly in the center of our ACOG site here, so I just interpolated the weapon location from its position at the hip to its position such that the optic center socket was directly in front of the camera. There was definitely some vector math involved, and I'm making it sound easier than it was, but the important thing is that it worked. You can clearly see now that our view at the hip and aim down sight is lining up perfectly with our little green test cube here, so mission accomplished, as they say. Another change I made to this system is that I am now using an ease in curve for my aim down sight interpolation. Going this way versus just linearly interpolating like I was previously makes things look much more interesting, so we'll stick with this slight ease in curve for now. The next biggest mistake I made last week was the sight picture wasn't nearly big enough. As you can see, it only takes up a very small fraction of the screen, and most of the screen shows the optic body as well as what is around the player. When people suggested making this change in the comments, I figured it would be a relatively easy fix. But when I went to make the change, I found it would require some pretty massive rework of my opacity mask system for the optic. The issue was that when we make the optic bigger, we have to hide more of the scope. When we hide more of the scope, the optic included in the scope mesh we're using isn't big enough to cover the entire area of the scope that we've hidden. The way I ended up fixing this was by abandoning the asset pack made optic entirely and instead creating my own. I made another socket on our assault rifle for the ACOG sight center and added a cylinder that I called our scope optic mesh. I positioned the socket such that it would position and scale our cylinder perfectly to match where the optic should be on our ACOG sight. The next step was to make an optic material to place on our cylinder mesh. I've always liked games where you can customize the reticle, so as you can see here, I set it up so that I can import any texture whatsoever and have a reticle in that shape. I also made sure to add a color tint so that players can choose whatever color for their reticle that makes them happy, which is definitely a nice quality of life feature. I then had to combine my reticle system with a plain glass material and add in my world position offset FOV function from last week, and we were all set with this material. As you can see now, our optic is taking up much more of the screen, which is great to see, but you'll also notice that I didn't fix the next biggest flaw that people pointed out in the comments. When you aim down sight with a real weapon, your entire view doesn't zoom in like it does in my implementation. Your entire view stays at the same zoom, and the only place where the view should zoom is the actual optic of the weapon. Some very helpful folks in the comments suggested using a scene capture component to fix this, so I looked up some tutorials and gave it a shot. For those who don't know, a scene capture component is basically another camera, but you can apply the output of it to a texture and place that on a material as you can see here. From there, all I'd have to do is put a glass post process filter on the scene capture component, combine this material with my reticle system, and place it onto our optic mesh. If I used this method, I could simply leave the field of view on the main camera the same and just zoom in the view on my scene capture component. I'd definitely take a performance hit, especially in the 4 player split screen configuration, where we'd essentially be rendering the scene 8 times, but there are plenty of ways to optimize scene render components, so I wasn't too worried about it. As you can see here, though, the result of this implementation was unfortunately a complete disaster. What's happening here is that the scene capture component is not acting the same way our main camera does. As a reminder, our characters need to have 2 character meshes, a first person mesh and a third person mesh. We only show the first person mesh when a human player is controlling the character, and show the third person mesh when it is not controlled by a local player. Unreal provides us with a couple of checkboxes called Owner No See and Only Owner See to accomplish this rather easily. Unfortunately, though, it seems like the scene capture component is not respecting those checkboxes. I was able to confirm in this test project that the issue was in Unreal Engine itself and not hidden somewhere in my implementation. We have a scene capture component feeding the circle above our player. The cube on the left is marked as Owner No See, and the cube on the right is marked as Only Owner See. If everything was working properly, we'd see the same result in the scene capture as in the scene itself, with the cube on the left being hidden and the cube on the right being shown. Unfortunately, though, the scene capture component doesn't know that we are the owner, so it hides the only owner C cube on the right and shows the owner no C cube on the left, which is the exact opposite of what should be happening. I used this test case to submit a bug report to Epic Games, and as of this recording, I'm still waiting for a response. My plan is that when the issue is fixed, I'll implement the scene capture component solution as I discussed here, but for now, we'll just have to live with the entire view zooming in instead of just the optic itself. Another update that commenters suggested making was to blur everything other than the sight picture. After watching some interesting videos on aiming with 2 eyes open, I learned that the technique requires you to focus really hard on the optic. The result of this is that the rest of your vision appears blurred. The way to implement this feature was to create a post process material that gives us a blur effect and place it on our camera. I then just attached it to our aim down sight logic to make sure that it only appears when we reach our aim down sight threshold and is hidden when we are at the hip. Before I was ready to call this done, though, I had to mask out the area of our view covered by the optic itself because we don't want the optic to have the blur effect, just the area around the optic. To accomplish this, I just had to repurpose our scope mask material function and apply the result to our post process material. Unfortunately, when I went to test, though, things did not look right. The blur effect was being masked, but not centered on the optic as it should be. I spent days trying to figure out what the issue was here. I initially thought it had something to do with my implementation of the field of view offset I made last week, and spent quite some time trying to figure out how to somehow apply it here without a world position offset node available to me. After days of banging my head against the wall trying to fix this issue, I noticed that the result wasn't even the same every time I tested. In fact, I could actually get the mask to work perfectly depending on the aspect ratio of my viewport. When I printed the aspect ratio to the screen of when it lined up and saw a value of 1.77, I'm happy to say that everything clicked for me. For those who don't know, 1.77 is the 16 by 9 aspect ratio that most games use. A quick Google search told me that in order to make the post process material work independent of screen aspect ratio, all I had to do was change the blendable location setting on my material from the default to before translucency. Debugging an issue for a really long time and then finding out that the fix is just flipping a simple setting is one of the most frustrating but yet best feelings while making a game. I genuinely thought I was going to have to make this video without this working properly, and I'm so happy I was able to figure it out. Now that our aim down sight result is looking pretty good, I just want to say thank you so much for all the feedback on last week's video. I was blown away with how many people left thoughtful comments on how to improve my game, and it provided me with a ton of great ideas that led to the improved result that you're seeing now. The way I see it, I'm the developer of this game, and every single one of you watching are my bosses. These videos are the weekly tech demos where I show off where I'm at, and you, the viewer, can give me feedback on how things are looking. I'm showing you much more of the development process than most devs choose to do because I genuinely want this game to be great and believe the best way to accomplish that is by constantly gathering feedback from the community and then implementing that feedback. I'm really excited about the future for creators and hope that you'll stick around to experience the journey with me. If you'd like to be a part of the community, consider subscribing so you can keep up with my progress shown off in these devlogs every Sunday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. Also, please continue to leave comments on the video, letting me know what you liked, what you didn't like, and suggestions for how to improve my game. I make sure to respond to every single comment, so definitely stop by down there and say hi. Also, definitely like the video if you feel so inclined, because it really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm and results in more people seeing my videos. The wishlist link for creators on Steam is also in the description, so definitely check that out if you like what you see so far. With all that being said, though, my name is Steve. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next Sunday night. Have a great week, everybody.